Liz is the co-CEO of the Tamarack Institute, where she's leading the Tamarack Learning Center. The Tamarack Learning Center has a focus on advancing community change efforts, and it does this by focusing on 5 strategic areas. Liz is well known for her thought leadership on collective impact and is the author of several popular and academic papers on the topic. She is a co-catalyst partner with the Collective Impact Forum. Welcome, Liz.
Thanks, Duncan.
Yeah, I'll also introduce Sylvia and Lisa. So Sylvia is a consulting director of the Collective Impact area with the Tamarack Institute. And she's passionate about community change and what becomes possible when residents and various sector leaders share an aspirational vision for their future. Sylvia believes that when the assets of residents and communities are identified and connected, they become powerful drivers of community change. Lisa leads the community engagement practice area at Tamarack to support cities, organizations, and collaborations as they seek to engage the community in making meaningful change. Over the last 6 years, her work has focused on creating authentic engagement strategies and training staff teams, teaching and writing about innovative engagement methods, designing and facilitating workshops with a focus of raising the voice of the context expert. Welcome, everyone. So Liz, before we get started, why don't we touch briefly on who's in the room and why this topic is important right now?
Sure, thanks, Duncan. So we are really excited to welcome you all on the call. We had 500 people register for the call, which is the limit that we have in our Zoom platform. And then a further 350 people signed up to receive the recording after the call. And so we're really excited about the number of folks that are interested in this topic. And we know that at Tamarack, that 500 registered also means that some people might not be able to join us right now, but will also get the recording post this webinar. We know that we have learners that have joined us from Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, New Zealand, and Australia. And so welcome to all of you that are in different places around the world. Some of you are up late at night. Others of you might be up early in the morning. And for those of us across Canada and the United States, we're all in these different time zones. So we really appreciate the fact that you've carved an hour out of your time to join us. And then you can see the sectors that we have. So we have some folks from the community sector, from government, especially from municipalities. A lot of you are interested in thinking about how to build virtual communities of practice, not only within your teams within the municipalities, but then across municipalities or across levels of government. We have folks from the health sector, education, and those of you that are working as consultants. And so that kind of gives us a sense of who's in this big virtual room that we have. If we haven't mentioned a country that you're from or a sector that you represent, please feel free to go into the chat box to introduce yourself and to let us know where you're coming from and what sector you might be representing. And so we invite you to do that as well. So we're going to start our webinar with a poll. And so this is a poll about communities of practice. And we really want to get a sense from all of you about what your experience with communities of practice are. So Duncan, if you can bring up the poll, we'll invite folks to jump on really quickly. And we're giving you one choice, but there are 3 options. So give a couple minutes. While you're filling in the poll, we'll just talk really briefly about communities of practice and give you a little bit of context and background from our perspective from Tamarack. We've been using the tool of communities of practice from the very beginning of Tamarack's inception in the early 2000s. Part of our work is to work with a variety of communities across Canada and the United States, particularly focused on place-based poverty reduction. And we initially started with a small cohort of about 13 communities. And we found what was really helpful with those 13 communities was to get them to talk to one another, to get them to really talk about, you know, the breadth and depth of poverty that they were seeing in their communities, and also begin to identify strategies for moving forward. And we really watched that initial community of practice really come together over the first 5 or 6 years at Tamarack. And so we've continued to support and invest in communities of practice. And so today will be a little bit about the lessons that we've learned in this area, but we also thought it would be good to kind of pivot a little bit and share with you all, what it means to support a virtual community of practice. So Duncan, I think we'll close the poll now and see where we landed with our audience. So this is kind of cool. There's 21% of you that have designed and hosted a virtual community of practice, and that's really great. So one of the things we would invite you to do during the course of this webinar is, if you have any tips or hints or tools or resources, and you're one of the people that fits into that 21%, please share them in the chat box. And what we're going to do is pull together a post-webinar overview with those tips and tools and resources. 32% of you have said that you've been a part of a community of practice, a virtual community of practice as a participant, and so that's kind of cool. And then 52% of you have said that you've never been. So we have some people with experience, some people that have actively participated, and then a large number of you for whom communities of practice are maybe a new concept, a new idea, a new approach. So let's just lean into what we learned about communities of practice when we started way back in 2002. And we basically followed the work of Etienne Wenger. And he has a great guide about communities of practice. But he basically said that communities of practice are groups of people who share this concern or this passion for something that they are doing together, or something that they would like to learn to do together better. And so the community of practice idea is really that a real strong focus on learning. And it's also about this setting up this kind of regular interaction. So it's not just a one-off where we gather a bunch of people together and we have a quick brainstorm. It's actually you're building a relationship over time. What we've learned about communities of practice is that they have some really interesting elements to them as we begin to frame them. So communities of practice are important tools to connect people. What we found in Vibrant Communities when we were working on poverty reduction, that each of the initial 13 communities had a different perspective about what poverty meant to them and their community, and so the community of practice enabled them to have a shared context around poverty and the shared understanding of what that meant. It really does and did enable ongoing dialogue. You can capture and diffuse knowledge across the network, and you can help people organize or invite the participants on in the community of practice to generate new knowledge. And there's lots of names for communities of practice. We at Tamarack have both called them communities of practice and learning communities. Other groups call them peer learning networks. Other groups call them peer-to-peer networks. And we'll hear from Sylvia at the end of the call, at the end of the webinar. We'll hear from her from a case study where they named their community practice collabs. So if we go to the next slide, we can see, the types of questions, the types of activities that are really framed or really relevant to a community of practice approach. And so it can be used for problem solving, it can be used for coordination and synergy. In some cases, people will form a community of practice around an area that they want to move forward from an advocacy lens or a advocacy perspective. So they might be building this argument, right, about, we're all working on poverty together. How might we influence the federal government to think differently about poverty? And so that's a really kind of interesting role that you can play with communities of practice. Sometimes communities of practice can be used to grow the confidence of the members. And, at Tamarack, we just published a tool, a virtual peer input process, and we use the peer input process with our Vibrant Community partners, where a Vibrant Community local roundtable will say, here's a question I would like my peers to give me some resources, some ideas around. So they'll present their the background and their question, and their peers will talk about, you know, that experience and what they've learned about, you know, trying to work in that area. And then that really gives some kind of cool input to the peer who's asking the question. We've also seen through communities of practice that you can do virtual site visits, but you can also set them up to do face-to-face site visits. And so we'll talk a little bit more later about virtual site visits. So those are ways that you can think about communities of practice and different kinds of activities that you can build into the community of practice that you're going to be designing. So there are some really important rules to consider in establishing a community of practice. And so there's the first role is the sponsor. So who is the key organization that's going to champion, going to organize, and at least initially, the community of practice? There are leaders within the community of practice. It might be a subset with the sponsor that you bring a couple of leaders together and you brainstorm together, you know, what are some of the topics we might want to cover in this community of practice? What are some of the ways that we're looking to engage our members purposefully? From time to time, you might bring in subject matter experts. You might develop some tools collectively using platforms like Google Docs. And so you might have content editors and then facilitators. So sometimes when you're pulling a community of practice together, you might require the use of or the engagement of an external facilitator. These are common roles that we've seen within the communities of practice that Tamarack has supported. If we go to the next slide, here are the 3 things to really consider for your community of practice if this is an area that you want to lean into. And you can use communities of practice for external groups, but you can also use them with your internal teams within your organization. So you might say, you know, we're dealing with the issue of COVID and how our team is responding. Let's pull together a little community of practice within our internal team and try to figure out how we support our internal team within our organization or our municipality. So you would want to look at the domain. What do we really care about? So we're caring about COVID and the mental health implications for our internal team. The practice, what are we going to do in the community of practice? Are we going to have conversations about it? Are we going to bring in external experts to tell us how to be more mindful or practice yoga? You know, you can think about that. So what would we do together over the course of the time? And then who should be in this community? Is it going to be only, you know, staff in our department? Is it going to be staff across the municipality or across the organization? So the more that you can define these 3 kind of core elements of a community of practice, the more successful you will be over the longer term. So the last slide that we have in this section is really to kind of think about it from a virtual lens. And here are some things that we have found to be really important, particularly if you're working at a pan-Canadian, a pan-national level, or a pan-state, pan-province kind of level, where you've got people in different localities. And now that we're all working remotely, it all kind of applies to us. So what is the digital platform that you're going to use? What's the strengths of that platform, and what are some of the limitations of that platform? And how will that both enable, but also perhaps detract from the community of practice and the engagement of participants? What's the bandwidth of all of the participants and the ability of the participants to connect virtually? So in Canada, with Vibrant Communities, we connect our participants in our communities of practice from coast to coast to coast. And we find that sometimes in northern and more remote communities, thinking about bandwidth is really important. And so people will come in and greet each other, but some people might go off camera to maximize their bandwidth. And so you want to have some agreements that you put into place around your community of practice. What are the agreements, which is a nice lead into the next one? How do we really intentionally include participants online? And Lisa's going to talk a little bit more about this in the design element of this presentation. And then what are some of the interactive tools that we might use? And so at this point, what we'd love to do is invite you, and I can see lots of people are entering into the chat box, but if you have some other suggestions around, particularly around virtual communities of practice, please put them into the chat box and we'll share them out as well. These are ones that we've encountered and have had to navigate from a Tamarack perspective, but we'd love to hear from all of you as well. So now I'm going to pivot quickly to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned at Tamarack around this work. And so the first lesson is really to kind of focus on the importance of creating connection. And so we know that, you know, connections are created in a couple of different ways. They're we found that, you know, connections are really important face to face, but that's not necessarily always something that we can do, and particularly if you're working kind of pan-Canadian or if you're working across large distances. And so you want to think about how can we use the virtual space to create some of that face-to-face connection. And you'll see that you're talking to me and you can see me, but you can see Sylvia's picture. And so this is a way that we could explore how to, while people are not necessarily on the screen all the time, we can still see each other's faces. If you have your partners putting their pictures up, or also thinking about how do we create a little bit of FaceTime during the course of the community of practice, whether we put people into small groups or if we put them into Zoom rooms or whatever functionality that we have, so at least people can be face-to-face for a portion. Really thinking about the online part of the work as well. So are we going to use the functionality, maximize the functionality of the platform, and really engage with people through chat boxes, through polling, through some of those other things that are becoming increasingly available. And we'll send some links to some of those tools. And then how do we link the community of practice to our web space, right? So at Tamarack, if tools and resources are developed through the community of practice, what we then do is we push out those tools and resources through newsletters, through other kinds of modalities that we have at Tamarack that are really important to keep people connected. It's also a really good opportunity to recognize the contributions of the members, that this was developed. The most recent 10 guide that we developed at Tamarack around social inclusion and the inclusion of the voice of people with lived experience was developed through a conversation and a community of practice event. And then they co-edited the guide together, and then the guide was pushed out. And it's become one of the most popular guides that Tamarack has produced. And it's really because the community of practice, the individuals in the community of practice were so engaged and shared their wisdom all the way through. The next slide really begins to lean into some of the elements around the principles behind the community of practice. And these come again from Etienne Wenger, who's really the grandfather, I think, in many ways of communities of practice. I think what we've learned and what we would say to support the first principle, this design for evolution. We've found that at Tamarack, not every community of practice goes on forever. And in fact, sometimes a shorter, more focused community of practice can lead to really kind of tangible results. And so you really want to design for what's the right length of time for this community of practice, and then how do we sunset it? And so really be intentional about that evolution. And I think then people can make commitments based on what the requirements are. You want to be able to invite different levels of participation. It's really critical to focus on the value to the people that you want to engage as participants and leaders in the community of practice, and continually ask them, is this valuable to you? Is this a community of practice that you're willing to continue to commit to? We've seen that people will vote with their feet, right? So you'll have a lot of interest at the beginning, but if people perceive that it isn't really valuable to them, they'll have other things that they do during the course of their day, and then they'll be less likely to come to the, you know, the third, the fourth, the fifth call. So the more we can kind of have participants join in the planning process, but always checking in with them about the value proposition that can make your community of practice more successful. And so the final slide in my section, before I turn it over to Lisa, we'll talk about design considerations, is really the 8 lessons that we've learned from our vibrant communities and cities, deepening communities, community of practices. That's hard to say. These are the things that we've heard back from our members. Again, the notion of value for members is really critical, because the folks who you're trying to draw into this community of practice are doing really, really busy work. And so there has to be a value add to them. There has to be an opportunity for them to learn or to connect or to, get feedback. So really think about that in the design. Engagement is really key. And so having people help you with the planning process, engaging them during the community of practice call is really critical. Looking at the chat box, responding in real time, thinking about engagement is critical. Expectations are important. Really seeking feedback and doing that evaluation loop is important, and leadership is, I think, also critical. So there you go. There's a little bit of an overview on the communities of practice and a little bit of the lessons that we've learned. And now I'm going to send it over to Lisa for design considerations. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks so much, Liz. So what I'm going to do now that we've had the high-level understanding of communities of practice and learnt some of Tamarack's lessons learned from Liz, I want to focus on how do you actually design a virtual community of practice. And a frame that's really helpful to think about is these 6 stages of developing a community of practice. Often we just think, okay, how do we actually start? How do we get it done? And I think that looking at these 6 stages helps us to understand that process more clearly. And so it starts off with inquire. And in that phase, that's really where we're looking to understand the audience, the purpose, what is our vision? Is this going to be of value to people? Are people interested? In the design, that's where we start to look at group size, frequency, topic, what are the functions that we want to do within that community of practice. Then we go to prototyping. And so this is really where you're working and you're wanting to pilot it with some of the key stakeholders. You want to test out that technology, make sure it's easy to use, gain the commitment, test some of the assumptions about the purpose of the community of practice, and refine the strategy if needed. Sometimes you could stay at this phase for a really short amount of time, and then sometimes you might be there for a long time. Sometimes you really want to test something out, gain a success story before scaling your community of practice more broadly. The next phase is launch. And so this is when you're starting to roll it out more broadly. You need, who are you inviting? What's the agenda? What's the topic? What's the focus? The second to last stage is is how we grow the communities of practice. And what that looks like here will look different depending on your goals. Sometimes it might be, if you're looking to do a group project, you might roll something out more specifically or more targeted or with a specific timeline in mind. And I think it's really about increasing those cycles of participation and contribution. The 6th stage is the sustain, renew, or close. Some communities of practice should be really time-bound. They're really focused in nature, where some are more open and allow things to grow and evolve and areas of interest come up, and then you might actually section off a group of people to form a smaller community of practice around something else. So those are the stages of community, of developing a community of practice. And we're going to focus in on that design portion. How do you actually decide what a community of practice should look like? And there's a lot of design considerations you can keep in mind. I think oftentimes, you know, we might have experience with a certain format of a community of practice. And so we don't actually kind of have a good view of what all of the possibilities are. And there are so many possibilities for that design of a community of practice. Here are some of the considerations that you would think through as you're designing. You're thinking through size, you know, from large to small. What's the appropriate size? I think it's really important to understand that the purpose of communities of practice is for peers to learn from each other and share with each other and develop the relationships and the connections. And so size is a really important factor here. So smaller, more intimate groups can really allow for that connection and relationship piece. But you may also want to, you know, scale a movement. And so how do you actually, if you have a large community of practice, how are you developing the connection? And so I think, and we'll turn to it in just a couple minutes, but that's often when we want to create those smaller groupings with breakouts and things like that, so that you still can establish connection and relationships, even if you have a large community of practice. Thinking through, you know, is this community of practice focused on teaching, you know, where people are sharing presentations, or is this really relational, where you're wanting people to kind of share heart to heart some of the challenges that they're facing? Is this community of practice being driven by an organization, or is it being driven from peers? You know, and it's really that peer-led, community-driven type community of practice. Where is it in terms of structured to unstructured? And so structured communities of practice have set activities that they would be doing and that people would be expecting on each call, whereas an unstructured community of practice is more that open space. Within our deepening community work, we've just launched a brunch chats, you know, where it's a community of practice, but really it's as if you're gathering around a kitchen table, and, you know, whatever people want to bring to that, they can. That would be an example of a really structured, unstructured community of practice. And then thinking about, is this synchronous or asynchronous, and how does that work? Synchronous is when everyone's joining at one time. Asynchronous is when people are contributing on their own time. And so some communities of practice are completely synchronous, some are completely asynchronous. Think about like a Facebook group. That would be another example of a community of practice that's purely asynchronous. And then oftentimes, and our recommendation would be that you have both. You have times that you gather together, and then times that you can connect in between meetups as well. So we're just going to zoom in on the last two there, the structured and the unstructured. And so I took, you know, a look at all of the communities of practice that I've had experience with, or that Tamarack has hosted, or that I've seen some of our colleagues host, and listed the various activities or functions on this grid. Looking at that structured to unstructured and looking at synchronous to asynchronous. And I think this can offer a little bit of a design canvas for us to kind of think through your goals. What are you hoping for? And what are some of the designs that might suit to help you achieve those goals? So on that top right, we have a format where people are presenting. So you might invite a speaker to come and share to a community of practice. And so they might share a 10 or 15-minute presentation, and then you might have open Q&A. That would be one format option for a community of practice. Liz was mentioning the peer input process. We love this for people who are really, you know, have developed relationships. They have high levels of trust with each other, and they're sharing what work they're doing and looking for direct feedback and input from their peers. And I'm actually going to put a link to the peer input process tool, and this is focusing on how to facilitate that virtually. So I've just put that in the chat box. And this provides that step-by-step instruction of how to facilitate a virtual peer input process. We then have guided discussions, and so this is where you have a specific theme focus, and then somebody would be leading the conversation and prompting it and moving the conversation along. We can have topic-focused discussions, so you have a broad topic, but not defined questions within that. You allow the conversation to flow. And then breakout discussions. So you might have a larger topic, and then you might identify 3 areas of interest that the group wants to discuss. And then you could, each breakout group could pick an area that they want to talk more deeply about, because that might be most relevant to their work. And then you could have open discussion. And so thinking about, just a free-for-all in a way. Just gathering together on a weekly basis, bringing whatever you want, to that conversation. We've talked about the chat box. That's a really great tool to use, so that even if one person is presenting, others can be contributing and sharing, as we're seeing right now. And then moving towards some of those more asynchronous things. Oftentimes it's really helpful to have some collaboration tools that we're using in conjunction with a community of practice. So these could be things that people contribute to while meeting together, on a Zoom call. So you could have a Google Doc in the background where you're taking notes and contributing to a shared document. And you could also continue working on that document offline as well and between sessions. We've seen great examples for people who are using communities of practice to try to document processes, or that example that Liz shared about creating a guide together and using a shared document writing process. And you can also see it with collaborative brainstorming spaces, that sort of thing. The sharing of resources is something that's really important and that we see come up a lot in communities of practice. I've done something and I want to share that with my community so that they can benefit from that. And so having some sort of document sharing or resource library can be really helpful. Email, is so simple, but how are you following up with the notes? Is note taking something that's important, or is this more of a casual community of practice? How are you following up and sharing back with members of the community? And then discussion boards are another example. And so these are often more unstructured. The community can contribute and ask questions, and then other community members can respond to that. And so I think what's really interesting is when you're looking at this grid, almost as a design canvas, and, you're circling the ones that might feel most appealing or might suit your goals. It's really important to think about the roles. Liz outlined the various roles that we've seen come up with communities of practice. So for example, if you have a discussion board, who is moderating that? If you've committed to sharing follow-up notes, who's taking those notes and sharing that? If you are doing presentations, who is surveying the members to decide what topics they're interested in, and inviting speakers? And so for each of these design options, really think through what are the roles and what are we asking people to do as they contribute to that. And let's look at some of the design questions, and I want to offer them here for you to take back as you look to develop a virtual community of practice. Follow through these design questions and respond to them with your team. Figure out your goals. How will those goals influence things like size and frequency? What are some of those formats that might work best? What might the needs be between meetups? Do people want to connect between meetups or not? And what technologies are people already comfortable with? We've included these design questions on a virtual community of practice tool that we'll be sharing with you as well. And so the last piece I want to hit on in terms of the design is looking at technology. And so one thing that we've seen with communities of practice is technology can be a huge barrier. And so when we're talking about virtual communities of practice, how are we actually setting people up for success when it comes to technology? And I think the most important thing is to understand what technologies are people already using, and if you can host your community of practice using technology that people are already comfortable with, or they're already meeting there for other things, your chances of success are going to be higher. This is a quick dump of the different technologies that I've used or seen used. If you have other tools that you love, we would love for you to share them in the chat box, and we'll be sharing out a list of the various technology options back to you following this session. So I now want to invite Sylvia to share a case study, and I think this is going to be really helpful because she'll describe the process that she walked through alongside a group as they were designing a virtual community of practice. Over to you, Sylvia.
Thanks so much, Lisa. Hi, everyone. Thanks for inviting me on as well. It is my privilege to share a little bit about a unique community of practice based in and sponsored by the United Way of Greater Atlanta, called CoLabs. So a couple of things I want to say about CoLabs. The first is that it was really spawned by this observation that the United Way had been making, that over the past several years, there were a number of collective impact initiatives kind of taking shape in the community. And they really saw a need and an appetite in some ways for an innovation space that would bring those collective impact initiative leaders together and practitioners to both build social capital and understand a little bit about each other's work, explore whether they might potentially work together on new opportunities and solutions to amplify impact, and then also to really learn about and support each other in just the practice and the work of collective impact. So you'll see enhancing effectiveness in learning, alignment and collaboration between and across their collective impact efforts, and really considering how to amplify impact. A couple things about the design that I think are really interesting. One, it was very much positioned as an exploration, and the recognition was it would be emergent, and the content and focus would be shaped in partnership with the participants. So initially, you'll see at the bottom, United Way was certainly the foundation builder that identified and invited members, thought about the design. They actually also tapped a couple of local community partners as well to support them in co-designing what the initiative looked like. And then we as Tamarack got involved as well to really help shape it, give some advice and support to the peer learning development, and also to provide curriculum if and when that felt useful. You'll see as well, they started with 15, but then grew to 20 members over the course of this experiment, which went on for over a year, just over a year. And while all were kind of operating in and around the Greater Atlanta area, some had a scope that encompassed the entire state. Some were very, very localized, and they also covered off a range of topic areas and interest. But overarching, what they shared was a commitment to enhancing the well-being of children in their area. Okay, on to the next slide, if you wouldn't mind, Duncan. So just wanted to give you a bit of a sense of the process, that the design process and the CoLabs process overall. A couple things to highlight. So United Way did a lot of groundwork to sort of confirm that there would be interest in a community of practice like this. They really kind of did a couple of iterations of the design in partnership with others. And when they launched, they did an in-depth invitation survey to participants and were able to come back and at the first event sort of share what they had collectively heard from CoLabs members in terms of pain points, sources of hope, biggest hurdles in advancing their collective impact work, and also what they intentionally might want to focus on with respect to building relationships and social capital between one another. And that was sort of presented and shared. One of the things that became very obvious, though, was that many of the members had varying levels of knowledge and understanding about each other's work. So in the early days, we used the Pechakucha process, there's different ways to say it, but really kind of giving 5 minutes, 5-10 slides for each group member to present a little bit about their work. And all the listeners were asked to sort of note what are some things, how might my initiative support this group, but also to think about how might this group help me achieve the outcomes of my collective impact project as well. And we found that that was a critical piece that needed to be in play before we could really start experimenting with what might be possible together. And if we can go to the next slide, Duncan. So you'll see here, just wanting to synthesize that throughout the process, there were opportunities where the members captured some key insights and learnings about the ways in which they were working, and also then began to crystallize around some of the tensions and or opportunities of this collabs peer learning process. We talked about the collabs paradox. So these are very busy folks, but at the same time, they're desperately hungry to learn with peers. And that was a tension that was navigated throughout. There was a real recognition that the way in which they were working, collective impact, was a very different way of working, and there was a need for real kind of shared education and information sharing about those differences, particularly with funders and other key decision makers. And then there was real exploration and opportunity around identifying leverages and synergies. So that's just like a quick, in a nutshell, overview of one example. And I'm absolutely thrilled that I have, I understand there's a couple of colleagues from the United Way of Greater Atlanta here on the call, and they have promised if folks have more questions and want to learn more about it, we'll be happy to help connect you to them after today's call. So I believe we are now sort of moving into the part of our agenda where we are happy to be welcoming questions from you all. And I've been sort of paying attention and see that there's some really juicy ones already starting to appear in the chat box, and you're doing a great job voting, everybody. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Duncan, if you don't mind, to kind of lead us off around the Q&A. But yeah, others, if new questions have emerged or comments, we'd welcome those to continue to show up.
Absolutely. Thanks, Sylvia. And yes, if you do have questions you've been holding on to, feel free to add them to the Q&A panel, and we'll try our best to get to them here or in the post-webinar email. So thanks, everyone, for jumping back on. First question comes from Juliana, and they ask, how do you start or engage virtual communities of practice in rural areas where internet or technology is not always accessible? I know that's a really tough one to start with.
I'll jump in because when I first joined Tamarack, way long time ago, all of our communities of practice were done by telephone, right? And so we at least, telephone's pretty reliable. We couldn't see each other face to face. And I think it's an old standby to be able to connect people that way. So if that's what you have to do, you can do it. And it's a little more difficult to see people face to face, and there might be, you might want to think creatively about, how to do that. So in one of the documents that you share, you might ask people to put a picture and a little bio about themselves and circulate that as, let's get to know who's in our community of practice. And so work with what you have, but I wouldn't let that be a limiting factor for your community of practice. I would just say you have to be a little more creative, but it's not impossible. Lisa, do you have any things you might want to add here?
Yeah, we've been thinking about this one a lot, and it is a challenge because we also want to focus on equity amongst participants, and if you say to a group, well, if you can't join by video, no problem, the rest of us will, it doesn't create that level playing field, where some people are able to connect more deeply than others. And so I just find it fascinating to think about this very real challenge we're all facing in terms of how to bring various groups from different, who have different access to technology and bandwidth. It is really interesting to think about tools that require higher bandwidth or connectivity than others. And so oftentimes, using tools that do require less, we often jump to the tools that are, highest are in rigor and demands for bandwidth. And so really challenge yourself. Do I need to do that? What could we do by email? What could we do with a shared document and some other things that people can contribute on their own time as well, as opposed to requiring that everybody join all at once. Those are just some of the things we're exploring. I know that a bunch of research is also happening in this field, as people are facing some of these challenges right now.
I think the only other thing I would jump in here and say is, you know, for some communities of practice, you might have to facilitate engagement, right? So is there a possibility within your community of practice to purchase data cards for people so that they can use their phone and participate? Or is can you build into your community of practice the purchase of cell phones for people? So to be really creative and to think about, okay, so what could we potentially do?
Great. One other thing I thought of that Lisa mentioned earlier is also the idea of like asynchronous communities of practice in online forums. Perhaps that's another option as well, to kind of limit the amount of bandwidth you need at all times to participate. But that's a really great question and lots of great suggestions. The next question comes from Elizabeth, and it's been echoed many times in the chat box. Any suggestions in terms of the size of the group?
Yeah, I can start with that one. When we think about, you know, what number of people permits a great conversation, we're looking at less than 7. And so I think it's important to look at your design and to think about what group size is important for specific activities within that. If you're doing a presentation, you could have a larger group, and then you could go into breakouts of groups of 5 to have a really rich discussion, allow different people to connect, especially if this is an ongoing series. You could be in a different breakout room each time with different people, so you slowly get to know more members, but you're allowing people to connect within those smaller groups that we know facilitate that connection. If you're doing something like a peer input process, you know, developing trust is really important so that each of the members can be vulnerable with each other. And so I think if you're doing something like that, you do want to limit it and ensure that you've built that trust over time before asking people to kind of share their biggest challenges, that sort of thing.
One other thing I would add is, in the spirit of sort of an optimal size on the small end, is that if it's something that you're going to have regularly, this group reconnecting, there's always, you know, things come up for people and you can sometimes have lower attendance. So you want to make sure that on the low end, the group doesn't start so small that if one person doesn't show up, there's not really a lot of energy for the rest of you folks. So, you know, 8 to 10 is probably a good size, knowing that, you know, if 1 or 2 people for whatever reason don't come to a particular session, you still have a robust group for a good conversation.
Wonderful. Thank you everyone for your answers there. I know it's a tough question, and it really does depend on the context. Next question comes from Teresa, and they ask, how does a community of practice differ from a committee, a task force, or an advisory group?
Really good question. I think communities of practice for me can be committees, but not always. They can be a task group, but not always. They're really that opportunity for people to learn together, to share wisdom with one another, and to engage in a different kind of way. So you could do a community of practice on a specific area that the group might be interested in, right? Or on a specific task like we talked about. There was a community of practice first around how do we engage folks with the lived experience of poverty. So that was the community of practice first, and they would have conversations, and then they said, what could we do together? And similarly, you know, when I first joined Tamarack, we had a group of folks across the country who were looking at living wage and how to advance the conversation across the country around living wage. And for a year, we met and talked about living wage practices in different communities. And then at one point, I was listening to the conversation and I said, what if we developed a shared living wage approach for every city and every province in Canada? What could that look like? So we were first talking about the concept of a living wage and how to advance it individually and collectively and what successes were. And then that evolved into something that we worked on together, which then led to the next stage. So, you know, that from Etienne Wenger, designing for evolution. Not everybody stayed in the working phase. Some people were only interested in the conversation phase, but it was really helpful to kind of think about, okay, so how do we engage them for the next phase of the work? And the group, you know, the group together said, wow, this is a really great idea. And we had some really focused work that happened over a shorter period of time. And then once the document was developed, we then moved on to then how do we distribute it and how do we build, you know, from there. So yeah, it can be those things, but it really is about what is it, what's the main, who are the participants. Going back to those 3 elements is really critical when you're thinking about, is this a good thing to form a community of practice around?
I really love your examples, Liz, because they show how one can emerge and evolve into another. For me, the characteristic that really differentiates a community of practice from, you know, a committee or a task force is that a community of practice is more emergent. We are not going in with a commitment that we must create a particular project or product at the end. It's really coming from that learning stance, curiosity, questioning.
Oh yeah, thank you everyone for your answers there. I think those are great points talking about that distinction. Our next question comes from Catherine, and they ask, any thoughts on building trust, especially if geographic distances are great or members occasionally compete with one another for grants? I think that's a very interesting question.
Do you want to kick us off, Lisa?
I can, but you are our resident trust expert, so I feel like this is a perfect Liz question here. You start off and then I'll jump in with any extra thoughts.
I think, you know, for me, trust is, if you think about Stephen Covey's waves of trust, trust starts with me and then goes in these exceeding waves, right? From me to the relationship I'm in, to the contributions of my organization, etc. And I think, you know, to really build trust is to get agreements amongst the participants about what a successful community of practice would look like, not only from a content perspective, but what they're willing to do to help facilitate the community of practice going forward, and where they're going to contribute. And that, you know, that's really important to kind of build that into the design features of it. So those commitments pieces. But I also think that trust is also about showing up, right? And showing up on communities of practice and you know, asking questions and, you know, depending on the learning topic that you're pursuing, to really be a participant in that process. And that really is a very deep trust building relationship. If, for example, you find that people are drifting from the community of practice, I would do something where I would call them up personally and say, hey, you know, we noticed that you were really engaged at the beginning. What's, you know, and you've been missing the last couple, what's happening, you know, and is there something that we could do differently to support your re-engagement, or do we just acknowledge that you're too busy right now and whatever that is, right? So it's kind of paying as much attention to the relationship aspects of it as you're paying attention to the content.
Mm-hmm. And creating spaces for feedback loops is a piece that came up there, Liz, where you always want to check in. You know, communities of practice are a little bit more organic by nature, you know, and they should evolve. And so, you know, if frequency needs to change because that's what the community members are saying, do that, you know, and it's about being responsive. I think another kind of tip that I would have, I think part of that question, Duncan, you know, was around how to encourage a more equal type of conversation. And one thing that can be helpful is to just offer some guidance in terms of how people discuss. So if you're going into breakouts, you know, even saying something like, hey, you know, we have time for each person to share for a minute. You know, something like that just plants that seed that everybody, you know, should have a chance to talk. Sometimes we say, okay, in each room, appoint, you know, a room facilitator who's going to make sure that everybody has had a chance to share. But naming some of that, if you're concerned that some people might dominate the conversation, can be, you know, just can bring it top of mind.
And the only thing that really comes to mind for me as well is the visual that we showed, you know, the 3 dimensions to think about: face-to-face, virtual, and then the persistent web presence. I think relationship building is key. People do need to understand and know what others are doing. So if we don't have a face-to-face component to our relationship, then it says to me we need to be a little more intentional about building that relational kind of connection and understanding intentionally into the virtual design.
Yeah, thank you, all three of you, for those responses. That's another one of those tough questions that takes a bit of context to sort through. I am just conscious of the time, so unfortunately it is time to wrap up. There are still lots of great questions in the Q&A panel and in the chat panel, and I know we'll be looking at those, and we're going to be sending something back to you. I just wanted to start off as we wrap up by thanking all of you, Sylvia, Lisa, and Liz, for joining us and sharing your wisdom. It's been a really, really cool conversation. All right, and as we wrap up, I just have a few quick announcements. Throughout the month of May, the Tamarack Institute is committed to bringing you free weekly community building webinars to help equip you for community change as we all adjust to a new normal. You can join us for discussions on systems change, collective impact, and how the arts can impact community change, and much more. And if you can't join the live event, you can still register and receive a full recording of the discussion. So you can visit the Tamarack website to look at our full offering of webinars. As well, just wanted to make sure everyone knows that you will be receiving an email in the coming days with a full recording of today's call, a copy of the slides, and a collection of links and resources that you've mentioned and have heard throughout the presentation. And if you want to learn more about upcoming learning opportunities, including webinars like this one, you can visit us at tamarackcommunity.ca. Thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and I hope everyone has a great day.